Article 2 of the Constitution assigns the executive power to a President of the United States. The means of selecting the President are spelled out in Section 1, Clause 2. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Now, the whole discussion of the evolution of the Electoral College and how it operates is beyond the scope of what we're attempting to cover in this course. There's a fairly good selection and discussion of it in the textbook, which I refer you to. There's also a very, very good discussion of the Electoral College in Wikipedia if you happen to want to go into it in a little more detail. The basic constitutional powers of the President can be classified into four main categories: security powers, national security powers, legislative powers, administrative powers, and judicial powers. The security powers include being Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The Constitution specifically makes the President the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To make treaties with foreign governments, but it requires two-thirds approval of the Senate before they can become effective. To nominate ambassadors. Now, this requires a majority approval of the Senate. And to receive ambassadors. George Washington took the position that the fact that he could receive ambassadors meant that he could decide whether or not the United States would recognize the government as being a legitimate government, and that no president has been challenged on that since that time. The Constitution provides that the President shall provide information on the State of the Union. Now, up until Woodrow Wilson in 1913, this was always done in writing and delivered to the Congress, where members of Congress could read it if they chose. Wilson broke with tradition and appeared before Congress to read his State of the Union address. It's been 100 years since then, and every president since Woodrow Wilson has appeared before a joint session of Congress to present his State of the Union address. He can recommend legislation to Congress. Now, until the 20th century, this generally was done as a general broad recommendation, but increasingly presidents present draft copies of legislation. This reached a high point in the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration in 1933, where when the special session of Congress began, a complete package of bills had been prepared. He may call special sessions of Congress. This hasn't proven to be particularly important in recent years because Congress stays in session almost full time, or to adjourn Congress if Congress cannot agree on a time for adjournment. Interestingly enough, this has never been used because Congress has always been able to decide that, and he has a veto. Interestingly enough, the power of the President's veto is less significant than the power of the veto of all 50 state governors. All 50 state governors have an item veto, which allows them to veto any particular item of an appropriations bill. The President does not have that. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and is given the authority to appoint the heads of departments as established by Congress, but this too is subject to Senate approval. Can he order the directors of agencies to do anything? Well, the Constitution simply provides he may request in writing the opinions of the heads of the executive departments. But presidents have taken it upon themselves to be in a directive mode. And if there are vacancies during periods of congressional recess, the president can fill those. They're called recess appointments. Now, the president has very, very broad clemency power. Except in the cases of impeachment, he can grant a reprieve or a pardon for any offense against the federal government. He also is responsible for the appointing of federal judges, though this requires Senate approval. Now, I'd like you to look in the book for the role of senatorial courtesy for the picking of district judges. In 1964, Louis Koenig, who was a student of the American presidency, wrote a textbook called The Chief Executive, in which he defined the roles of the president as a chief executive, the chief legislator, the chief diplomat, the commander-in-chief, but also party leader and head of state. It's been a long time since Louis Koenig wrote his book, but this particular set of definitions of the roles of the president has continued to be extremely useful. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Congress finally acted to deal with the question of presidential succession. Now, the Constitution itself provided in the event of the death, resignation, or removal from office of the president, the vice president would become president or would assume the duties of president. It then provided that Congress would decide what officer would or who would become president in the event that that line of succession played out, and the Speaker of the House is in that position. The 25th Amendment sought to clear up a couple of problems. How to replace the vice president, and secondly, how to deal with presidential disability. I recommend that you read the 25th Amendment, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It is a lengthy amendment, and I don't want to really take the time to go into it in great detail here. And there are some key issues in presidential leadership: how he deals with the press and how the public approves him. We'll have a separate little lecture on the question of presidential approval. The presidency has not been static. From Washington to McKinley, most presidents claimed to be strict constructionists. They limited their power to those things granted in the Constitution or granted by Congress, though, as we're going to see, there were some notable exceptions to that. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, he said that actually the Constitution gave him much broader power than that. He was the steward of the people, and whatever powers were not illegal he could exercise if they were necessary. One notch beyond that is the prerogative theory, that the president can do whatever is necessary to protect the nation, even if it might be of questionable legality. Franklin Delano Roosevelt pursued that particular theory in World War II, before World War II began, by using what was known as a Lend-Lease program to provide supplies to England, a combatant, although it, strictly speaking, was illegal under the Neutrality Act. The presidency has grown. Some of the first glimpses of that were Thomas Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory without having consulted Congress, Andrew Jackson's efforts to remove the Cherokee from the southeastern part of the United States. Lincoln greatly expanded the powers of the president during the Civil War, and we've already mentioned Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, two progressives. What are the tools of presidential leadership? Well, we're going to look at those in another set of lectures dealing with the executive branch. But they're the cabinet agencies, the 15 agencies that have been designated as having cabinet-level rank or so designated by the president to attend cabinet-level meetings. Commissions, ad hoc, meaning for the moment, established by Congress or by the president to review important issues. An example of that would have been the Presidential Commission to study the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the Executive Office of the President, which we will look at a later point in time. And that concludes our discussion of the President.